Hi, my name is Jonathan Daly, and this is a tutorial on Unreal Engine 4 and Blueprint interfaces. We have a really simple level here, so we'll go ahead and play this. So it's a first-person game, and we have these two different kinds of items that are sitting here floating. And if we walk up to them and left-click on them, we can use them. They kind of blip out of existence. So we've used those items. So what we're wanting to do, though, is we're wanting to take these sphere items, and they're actually a BP item flammable, so we won't be able to set them on fire, which is a pretty cool thing to do in a game. So a little bit of setup here. We have this BP item class, which has code for using the item, and it also has code for the floating effect, which is just using sign over time. And then I subclass that, so I right-clicked on this and said create child blueprint class, and I made this BP item flammable. And in here we have two functions. It's toggle on fire public, and I'll explain later why it says public. Toggle on fire public, and then we also have an is object on fire. So this is kind of a cool kind of bonus thing to this tutorial. A cool thing you can do with particle systems, if you want to check if a particle system is almost over and not entirely over, you can check for the number of active particles. So in this particle effect we're using, and I'll just show you. So in this flame system particle effect, find the activate. So if I activate it, you can see that there's both some fire, but also some smoke. So I have it checking for how many particles are left because the smoke particles disappear slower than the fire. So I let the fire disappear, but not all the smoke, to say if something's actually on fire. So we'll turn auto activate back off because we won't be able to turn this on and off dynamically. So all of this is controlled from our character blueprint. So I'm going to zoom out here. So I have two different input action events. I have one that is use item, and I have another one that's set item on fire. So this is just kind of review this. This right here is just standard boilerplate code. This is to make sure that if you have a left mouse button down, you can't click the right, and vice versa, just to have a clean input. Then I collapsed my line trace by channel into a function, so it's doing a line trace by channel and all the math involved to make sure the line trace is correct no matter what direction you're looking. And we return whether or not it was a hit and what actor was hit. So pretty standard stuff, and you've definitely hopefully seen this before. You know, when you cast you have to take an actor and cast it to a particular item to be able to call a function on it. Standard stuff with Blueprint. So let's go ahead and actually implement the item on fire. So we're going to take the hit actor, and we're going to have to cast this to our flammable item, and from there we'll call our toggle on fire public function, and we only do this if this was actually a hit. So if there wasn't a hit, then we don't want to actually call this function, because otherwise this hit actor would be null or not valid. So compile and save, and we'll go back and we'll play. So now if we walk up to these yellow objects, I can right click on them and hey, they'll set on fire, which is great. Now this isn't the best way to do this. This works, obviously, we can run up to these things and set them on fire, but there's actually a better way to do this. And the reason is, if we go back to our character, here's a question. What happens if there's more than one item in our game that's flammable? Right now we have this BP item flammable, but what if we made a door? Or what if this is a game that has magic and you're fighting orcs and another person on your team makes an orc and the orc can be set on fire? Well, now I have to, try to cast to this flammable item. If that fails, I now have to do another casting to an orc or to a door or anything else that can be set on fire. So it becomes really cumbersome, because then you have to remember, oh, is this particular object able to be set on fire or not? And you have to keep cast and cast failed and cast again and cast again. There's a better way. So what we're going to do instead, we're actually going to replace these casts with blueprint interfaces. So what we're going to do is actually go into our content browser, and I already have a folder in here for interfaces. So what an interface is a way to define the functionality that a blueprint object is guaranteed to have. So what's really nice about this is you can add an interface to any object. So if I right click and go down to blueprints in this menu, and I can find blueprint interface. Now I like to prefix my objects in my content browser with prefixes so I know what the UAsset corresponding UAsset file is. So in this case I'm going to say BPI underscore item. Now we're doing the item first. We're going to get to the flammable stuff, but we want to basically do the same thing with the item, because not only can multiple things in our game be flammable, multiple things can be usable like an item is. But actually, let me rename this. It's better. It could be an item. So I'm thinking we're going to use this on an item, but let's call this BPI usable. So what this means is this is going to be an interface that we can put on any blueprint to indicate that that blueprint is usable, meaning that, hey, we can use this thing. So maybe we could use an item or use a door to open the door, or we can use a pickup or something like that. So what we're going to do is double click on this interface. Now all an interface is a list of functions that we're going to say, hey, the blueprint that implements this interface is always going to be able to respond to this function or this event. These turn into events. So what I'm going to call this is use item, and that's it. I'm going to leave it like that. I actually am going to adjust the category. I'm going to actually change the category name to BPI underscore usable, the same name as the interface. Now the reason I do that is, make sure you click compile and save if you're if you can be following along. I make this category the same as the interface, so it's much easier to find the interface messages inside of the context menu in a blueprint. So we're going to go back to our item. Remember I said I was going to talk about why this is called use item public, or in the other blueprint, the toggle fire public. The reason is this is a public function right now. Its access specifier is public, which means that anything that has a reference to this item can call this. So what we're actually going to do instead is we're going to change this from public to protected, and then we're going to go into our event graph. Just go over, there's some free space. We're going to right click, and now you can see that, well, first we need to compile. Before we get to that, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we would right click in here, and under add event we have our standard events. Now we want to have a new event show up here from our interface. So we're going to go to class settings, and in class settings there's an interface section down here. So if I click on add, I can find our BPI usable interface blueprint that we just made, and click on that. And now if I click compile and I right click again, if I go into add event, you can see now there's a new section here, BPI usable. This is the category we wrote on the function inside of our BPI usable blueprint interface. So if I click on this and say there's now event use item. So now we have a custom event, and it says it's from BPI usable. It has this logo here with the gear and the two arrows. This is the interface logo. So whenever you have an interface message or an interface event happen, this logo will show up. So you can kind of see, oh, okay, this is from an interface. So now what we can do is we can take our use item public function and we can just call it from use item, right? Now this is going to work. There's a little bit of a problem here with this return value, but we'll get to that in a minute. So if we just create something in our interface, a function that only has inputs or no inputs, it will become an event in our blueprint. So now what we can do is back in our character, instead of doing this cast, you'll see we have a warning here. So instead of doing this cast and calling this function, instead we're going to actually delete these. Now this warning is warning us that the particular function we're trying to call now is no longer public, it's protected, which means it can't be called from anything outside of itself. So we're going to actually delete these, and instead we're going to come off of the actor that we hit with our line trace. We're going to search for does implement interface. So this is a node that returns a Boolean, so true or false, and we can actually select our particular interface, our BPI usable. And then we can do a branch from here. And this branch, if it is true, if we have hit something and it implements this interface, that means that this actor, which we'll double click in the middle here to get an extra node wire point, we can now actually call inside of our BPI usable interface, it says use item message. So you can see there's a little envelope here. This envelope means this is a message. So this is through an interface. So we are trusting that this particular object, which is this actor, implements this interface, which we've checked. If it does, we'll send it use item. And then we can go and we'll talk about this in a minute, about how to fix this. So we don't have a return value on this. We'll fix that in a little bit. So now, since we've added this interface, we're now actually going through the interface to tell the item to be used. So if we play this, we can now still use these items. We can left click on them and they're used. Now you'll notice there's no use item print message in the top left corner, which is fine. We'll get to that in a minute. But we can now use this item. So again, this is exactly the same functionality, right? Before we did all of this with the interface, we could go up and we could left click on it and it'll be used. But now we're not having to cast, which means that if we made another item that was usable, we could just implement the usable interface. We could basically just add, just like we did with this, go into class settings, and this is in our character, in our item, go into class settings, and we could just add this interface. And we'd get access to this event use item, and we could have anything happen in that item when we go to use it. Now, I told you we would fix this little problem. We have this return value, successfully used item. So what we're actually wanting to do is have this return a value. Now, the first thing we're going to need to do, and it sounds a little roundabout way, but we're going to need to delete this. Now, I'll tell you why right now. In an interface, so if we're back on our interface file, if an interface function, if it says nothing in inputs and outputs or just some inputs, then it'll show up as an event. However, as soon as we add an output, so in this case this is going to be B item used, and I'm putting a B in front of it. It's just an old habit of mine. It's a naming convention in Unreal 3 and 4 where the lowercase b in front of a Boolean value. So this now has a return node, a return value. So if I click compile, if I go back into my item, you'll actually see in the My Blueprint tab, we have a new section here called BPI Usable. So if we open this up, we now have use item. It's now showing up here. It doesn't show up as an event anymore. And the reason is it has a return value. So if there's an output to your interface message or interface function to this, if this has an output, it shows up as a function, not as an event. So just a small difference there. So if we go back into the item, now what we can do is still call our use item function that we had from before. So we can do this, and what we can do is just return this. And now when we click compile and save, if we go back to our character, we can now see that our use item message has this item used return, and we can just plop it right into our branch, just like we wanted to. So now we have the exact same functionality as before. So let's really quickly do that flammable item, and now you'll see where this becomes really, really, really useful, because we're not going to be casting to this particular flammable item. We're going to be able to mark anything in the game as being flammable. And how we do that is we're going to create a new interface like this usable one, but a little different. There's going to be one for if something is flammable. So if we go back to our content browser in our interfaces folder, I'm going to right click and say in our blueprint section, blueprint interface, and we're going to make a new one called BPI flammable. Go ahead and open this up. So inside BPI flammable, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say toggle on fire. So this is going to be our first function that we're going to add in here. And then we need another one called is on fire. And the reason for that is we already have the functionality to ask if the item's on fire or not. And we don't want to be able to use an item that's on fire, because you don't want to pick up something that's on fire. That's kind of bad. So we added these two. Now the is on fire, we do need to return a Boolean value. B is on fire is what we'll call that. Go ahead and also set the category to BPI underscore flammable. That just makes it super, super simple. We'll go ahead and copy that and add the toggle on fire to the same category. It just makes it super simple to be able to find these later. On really large projects where you have multiple different interfaces, like half a dozen to a dozen interfaces, it becomes much easier to just look for the BPI prefix and then find all of your different interfaces when you're trying to call different messages. So now that we've added these functions to this interface, let's go to our BP item flammable, its class settings, and we're going to add BPI flammable. Now, another interesting thing to note, you can see there's a section called inherited interfaces because BP item flammable is a subclass of BP item. It inherits the usable interface. So this actually has the usable interface as well. So the code for using items still works like it should. So we're going to click compile and save. And now we have this new section pop up in our interfaces. This is on fire. So what we can do is, well, what we did before was actually just took basically this is object on fire. We dragged this in and called it, which you can do, but you're basically using a function to call a function at this point. So instead of that, we're going to open our is object on fire public function, and we're going to take these nodes and we're going to cut them. So Control X or Command X, and we're going to go to our interface and paste them in. Basically, we're just moving the code from a public function into our interface. So if we click compile, we can actually delete this code because there's nothing in here, so we can actually delete that function. So we're taking the functionality and moving it from a function on this particular object to inside the interface functions that are being created for us. Now the other thing we want to do here is we do have an event. So we have this BPI flammable, but we need to go add event. So if we go into the event section, we're going to get the event toggle on fire, which is the event that gets called when you tell this item to toggle on fire. Now this gets a little confusing because you can look at, there's a BPI flammable section here that's not under add event. If we were to click on, say, toggle on fire here, there's a toggle on fire and toggle on fire interface call. These end up being the function to actually call the function on this object. So this is to call it, so basically tell the object toggle on fire. The object itself, right, because we're inside this BP item flammable, it needs the event to receive that message. So that's why you need to go into the add event section and then go into it. So now what we're going to do is take this toggle on fire public. Now, one thing I like to do, I know on this one, since this is an actual function, this is on fire, I copied and pasted the code in here. However, when there's things that are events like this, so if we go back to our event graph, when there's an event for an interface, I actually like to encapsulate most of the functionality in a function already. So I'm going to take this toggle on fire public, I'm going to change its access modifier to protected, so it can't be called anywhere except through the interface, because you don't want people not using our interface. And I'm actually going to rename this to remove the public at the end. If it'll let me actually rename, there we go. Okay. I'm actually going to take this into toggle on fire internal. So the reason I'm saying internal is I can't call this toggle on fire when this is also called toggle on fire. It's called basically the names are kind of colliding with one another. So the reason I like this in a function is this code is not a lot. It's really just toggling it active. But if we needed anything else to happen, like a sound effect to play, or we wanted more than one particle effect or anything, I like to kind of keep my event graph clean, because now I just have 2 nodes here and not 4, 5, 6 or anything else. So this is going to allow us to toggle the thing on fire through the interface. So I click compile and save, and now go back to our character. And inside the character, see this toggle on fire internal, we're getting that warning again. It's like, hey, this isn't public. So I'm actually going to delete both the cast and this item on this toggle on fire. I'm going to delete those. I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to go off the actor. We're going to go into search for, if you just search for the word implement, that'll bring up does implement interface. And we want to make sure the interface that we have selected is this BPI flammable. So we're going to now do a branch, and inside this branch, if we did have a hit and it implements this interface, we are now going to tell it off of true. We're now going to go into BPI flammable. I'm going to look around my mic. BPI flammable and toggle on fire. And there we go. Click compile and save. And oh, I forgot to do a target. I always do that. So on an interface, this is important. I'm actually kind of glad this came up. On an interface, you always have to give it a target because it has to know what thing it's sending to. So it doesn't default to self. Some nodes will actually have a target and then have self in parentheses next to them. But interface messages don't do that. You have to be very explicit about what you're targeting. So I'm just going to double click in the middle of this wire to get a reroute node and come over here and dump it into target. And now we can click compile. Everything will work. And if we go to play, now when we walk up to these spheres, we can right click and they'll set on fire. Alright, so last thing I want to do, I know this is a little longer video than I kind of wanted it to be, but that's fine. We can still use these items even though they're on fire. That's kind of bad. That's not really realistic. So we're going to really quickly add a little bit of code here. So now if we go to use this item, we can actually do this a couple different ways, but the easiest thing to do is when we go to actually use the item, right? This is using an interface. What we can actually do is a little bit of kind of trickery here. So when we go to use the item, there is this item used return, right? So if we go into BP item right now, so we're using this use item public, which actually it's not public anymore, it's protected. So what we're going to do is really quickly rename that. Just hit F2 on your keyboard and you can rename it. We're going to call this use item internal, just like we did otherwise. So I'm going to click compile and save. Now the reason I'm leaving this as a function as well inside here is I want to actually override this. So this is kind of a little bonus thing. So if we go into BP item flammable and we go into our functions area, there's this 21 overrideable note in the parentheses. So I click override. This use item internal, I can actually tell it to override this function. So I'm actually going to change its functionality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first check and make sure if this item is actually on fire or not. So I'm going to use my isOnFire interface. I'm going to drag it in. Now see, I can actually drag it in just like any other function. Now this is an interface function, but it's also implemented inside of this blueprint, so I can use it just like any other function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, let me check if I'm on fire first, right? So I'm going to make a branch. Here's a shortcut. Hold down the B key and left click, and you'll automatically create a branch. Move these over. So I'm going to check if this is on fire. If it isn't on fire, I'm going to call my parent use item internal. So if I'm not on fire, then I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not on fire, so do what you would normally do for using an item. Now I'm going to do an alt left click to remove this. We'll handle this return item in a second. If I am on fire, then I don't want to use. I actually want to return false here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this return and say promote to local variable. And I'm going to rename this instead of new local var 0, which is a horrible name. I'm going to rename this as item used return value. Or maybe use item return value. That's going to be a better name. Because this is a use item method. So use item return value. So this is a local variable. It's just local to this function, but we can use it like any other variable. So what I'm going to do is drag this out, hit set. So if this branch is true, means we are on fire, we actually want to set our use item to false, which means we couldn't use the item. And we're going to then exit this function. But if we were able to use it, we want to have our parent try to use it. And maybe our parent has some other logic for using and not using. It does it now, but just in case for, in the future it does. We're going to drag this out and set this again as whatever the return value of this is. And then we're going to set it and then return. Alright, so what are we doing here? Let's go through this. So for our item flammable, just for that, we've overrode use item internal, which means if use item, so if we go to our BP item, if use item is called, if it is a standard item, which is this one, we're going to say, well, just call useItemInternal, which is it's going to set the collision, it hides the actor, sets its lifespan, so it gets destroyed, right? And then it always returns true right now. But maybe in the future, this could be something different. So if it's called on the BP item, it's going to use this version of useItemInternal. But if it's called on a flammable item, because it's a subclass, it could actually call its version of useItemInternal, which is this. It checks on whether or not the thing's on fire. If it is on fire, it sets our return value to false, and then just goes and returns it, which is returned with these two nodes. But if it isn't on fire, right, if on fire is false, it will call the parent version, which is, again, this version. It says, well, go ahead and do what you normally would do when using the item, and then we'll say, okay, what was the return value? We set it to our local variable, and we return it. So this is a way to kind of use both an interface, right, so we can know that this item is flammable because it uses this interface. We have this functionality is on fire because of the interface we have, but at the same time, we're using the functionality in our code that's already in our item class. So we kind of a double whammy here of both things happening at once. So let's test this out. So if we click play, if we run up and we can use this item, we can set it on fire. We can use this one, but this one's on fire, so let's try to use it. Oh, if we try to left click, it doesn't work. Now if I right click, you can see that the fire goes away. Now here's the cool thing. If I right click, it's on fire. If I right click again for it to stop, but there's still some smoke, I can still actually use it. See, there was still some smoke there, but no fire. The reason that that works is, again, this is on fire function is checking for how many particles are left. If there's more than 6, we're saying it's on fire. If there's less than 6, we're like, well, the fire's probably gone. It's, but if the smoke is still there, it's fine. This video was supported by patrons on my Patreon page. If you're a patron, thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to support me making more videos like this one, check out the videos on the left, subscribe to my YouTube channel below, and become a patron by clicking on that big orange Become a Patron button. See you next time!